Hey, welcome back, one and all, to the Information Revolution, a podcast for people working in information or just rather interested in it. My name is Michael Upton. I'm an information management consultant and I'm based in Wellington, New Zealand.
And my name is Judi Vernau. I'm an information architect. I'm usually based in Wellington, but right now I'm on holiday in London.
Fantastic. And I'm Karl Melrose. I'm a consultant. I'm based out of Adelaide in South Australia, coming to you from all over the globe today.
Those of you watching on YouTube will see that things look slightly different because we're sitting here at night time in the Southern Hemisphere. Anyway, what we thought we could talk about, we've looked at a whole variety of models over the course of recent episodes. So valuation in itself is a way of modeling information or modeling things that businesses do. We've even, kicked about the sacred cow that is functional classification, which is certainly another way of modeling information. And we thought that another aspect that probably isn't touched on so often by information people is the concept of domain modeling. So this is one that I think I could definitely hand over to Judi to get the ball rolling on. Any comments, Judi, perchance?
Sure. Well, I mean, going back to a very early discussion that we had around understanding what you've got, which ties in very well with the valuation thing, but being able to understand your information landscape. And people often tend to think that that's just about how much stuff have you got and where is it, which, as I've said myself on this podcast, is a really important part of it for one particular reason. You need to know what's where and how much of it there is so that you can manage it in that particular way. But the other side of that coin is, what's it actually about? What is it that the organization cares and writes about, thinks about, talks about? What are these things that are being discussed every day in business or entities or whatever it is you want to call them? Things is quite a good word, I think. Anyway, so in order to understand your information landscape as just one aspect of this, you also need to understand what the information is about, and therefore you need to model the domain that you're working in. And that involves understanding the overarching domain of the organization, but it also means understanding the different parts of the organization as well. And this is really important for being able to understand the information landscape and to value it. But it also then becomes important for a whole raft of other things, including findability, for example. And so when I run my information architecture course, plug, at Wellington University, plug, I introduce domain modeling very early on when we're talking about discovering the information landscape, but then we revisit it later when we start to think about developing taxonomies and ontologies and that kind of thing. Because again, you need to understand what are the things, the very important basic things that the organization cares about in order to start being able to structure. And actually a functional classification is the same, except that a functional classification tends to look at things, the classical ones tend to look at things from a perspective of what's being done, I would say, rather than what is this about. And that's kind of different. And you need to understand all of the things that your information is about. It's not just about, I don't know, HR, but what are the things involved in HR? Employees and contracts and, I don't know, health and safety, whatever we think that means, and all those different things that are important in that area, and which we, very importantly, hold information about. So domain modeling is really thinking about, what is this area that we work in, and what are the things that we talk about, write about. So, for example, health is a really good example that I use with the students, and it's absolutely fascinating to say to them, okay, so if we're thinking about the domain of health, what are the different things, concepts that are important in this area? And then we write them up on the board. And I would say 9 times out of 10, because I've done this quite a lot, 9 times out of 10, just about the last thing they come up with is condition or illness or disease or whatever you want to call it. And you think, why is this? I don't know. And music, we quite often do music. And what's the last thing they come up with? The piece of music. They'll
Right.
come up with compositions and all kind, or types of composition, genre, instrument, that kind of stuff. But it's really interesting how often you don't see the wood for the trees, as it were. And so in health, they'll often come up with health practitioners and hospitals, and quite often we start to get into things like budgets and policy, and I'm going, yes, but why? But why? What is the thing that we care about here? And then finally they get to think that actually in this domain it exists because of bad things happening to people, like illness and conditions like broken legs, but they don't necessarily think about it in that way. But so much of information in the health sector is about illness and things, those kinds of conditions. In the music
Mm.
business, it's about pieces of music. At Kaingora Homes and Communities, where I've been doing some work, what's really important, it's the homes and communities and the people who live in them. And then we need to spend time drawing out all of the other entities that then relate into those things and how they relate. And then we begin to understand what the information is about in this organization, and we start to understand the labels that we give to those entities. So if we say a home, what do we mean? And is a home a house? Well, no, clearly not, just because some people live in apartments. Some people live in tents.
Home
Some
describes
people
a
live in
relationship.
camper vans. Yeah. So you need to describe the relationship as well. But we need to be absolutely clear that when we're talking about, let's say, homes, we all mean the same thing, which might seem obvious, but again, it just isn't, because people do mean different things by different words, even when you think they mean the same. So doing the domain modeling helps you to understand what all this stuff's about, helps you to understand connections between things, and helps you to start um, zoning in on the vocabulary and being sure that we're all using the same words to mean exactly the same concept, which is the only way, by the way, you're going to be able to report on these things effectively. So, further down the line, how are you going to be able to report on this if you mean a different thing? We all mean different things by this. How many homes have been built? Yes, but we've just built loads of blocks of flats. Is that a home? It might be. Yeah. But in that building over there, they've also got a pharmacy and a hospital, and so is that building a home, etc., etc. And you need to do the domain modeling. The domain modeling is the only way you're going to get to the bottom of that, in my view. And representing that back to your subject matter experts, well, you need them to tell you, because as an information architect, I'm not going to understand every last bit of finance or homes and communities or whatever it is. So I need them to be able to tell me, but I do understand basic types of entities. And Yeah, I mean, a while ago, I worked on a New Zealand all of government ontology in which we were really trying to identify the very basic concepts in government in New Zealand, and could we identify them, describe them, and connect them in a way that would be useful across government? And there's information about that on the web. You can find that published by Archives New Zealand. But again, we're trying to join things up across the organisation, but across organisations in that instance. And so we really need to get to the bottom of what these things are and how they connect up. And that's, I mean, obviously there's a huge overlap there. I mean, what you're doing really is what some people would call data modelling, but this is a little bit of a step before that. Some people call domain modelling information modelling, which I don't mind, except that if I was modelling information itself, I'd have to be thinking about the structures of information in order to get all its different aspects. So I prefer to keep it even more at a kind of higher conceptual level than that, and just try and think about the concepts themselves rather than the way they exist in the world, if you like. Sorry, that's not very well expressed, but
No, I
yeah.
thought it was
So
great.
the data modelers are moving towards implementing this conceptual model, domain
Mm.
model, in a system. So we go from conceptual model, which is what this is, into a real physical data model. But you need to understand what these things are at a level that everybody can understand before you can start doing your system specific data models. So that when you build a data model here and a data model over there for this system and that system, you're still going to be able to share data. Yay!
As soon as you started talking, I was just everything you were saying was just sounding kind of like master data and transactional data to me, and entity relationship modeling. And I mean,
Yes,
I'm doing some
yes.
work at the moment, and we're looking at data warehouses and the way data
Yep,
starts in one part of an organization and moves through, and what does that mean for concepts of record and all of those sorts of things. And I mean, these are exactly
sure.
the things we're dealing with. And there's a project team that I've been on where honestly I think we spent 3 months just having it took us 3 months of regular conversations in the team to get to the point where we were actually talking about the same thing. I think that's the one thing I'd say is that I think modeling is one way to get there, but I mean I think conversation is another way to get there as well. If you But not that action oriented conversation. I mean I think lots of people engage in action oriented conversation all the time. They don't make room for that discussion and reflection, which is where you can actually start to surface the way that you think differently about the same things.
Yeah, and an interesting way, I think it's interesting, of testing out whether you're talking about the same thing is exactly what I think you're saying, is getting people to talk about it and see what the words are that they use around this concept. So, I mean, particularly when I'm doing ontology work, a really good way of testing out whether you've got an entity that everybody agrees on is whether the relationships between that and other things always work. Does this always, and you do that by talking about it. So what are the verbs that we use with this noun? Are they always the same? Oh no, he says created or whatever, and she says, I don't know, something else, runs.
Excellent.
Um, it can't be the same concept because those two verbs cannot be used with this
The
one
same thing.
concept. Yeah,
Yeah,
if it's the same thing. Yeah, it's fascinating, actually, endlessly interesting,
yeah.
but really important if you want to understand, if you want to be sure that your data is sound and your reporting is good. I mean, that's just those reasons, quite apart from
Mm.
findability um, and just generally speaking the same language in an organization.
That issue of language, so important. I mean, and it's just you're just triggering lots of little memories for me. And one of them is that there's a project team that I was working in where the vendor that we'd bought there had a specific definition of rot, and we had a BA who had no records background who was talking to someone who'd been in the industry for a long time, and they were both talking about rot, and one of them was saying, "Oh, it's the same as this other concept that we have in the organization." Absolutely wasn't, because the way the BA was thinking about rot was completely defined by what the way this vendor defined rot, which was, as specific file types.
Gosh. Yeah.
And it was interesting because they had a conversation, and they went away thinking that they were both talking about the same thing, and they were talking about something completely different. And the only reason I kind of knew was because I had my head in both worlds at the same time, and I realized that, where they were getting a definition from. But it's just such
I think in customer relationship management, that you quite often talk about accounts. And what does that really mean? What does that really mean?
we talk about
Is it
customers.
is it the customer, or
No,
is
but
it?
what I mean is the customers is the same problem. Like the
Oh
way
no,
customers
customers is the same. Oh God, yes. Oh yes, absolutely,
Nightmare.
absolutely. Customers, clients, patients. What are these
Mm.
things? Users. Yeah.
people.
That's people. Yes, quite people.
Related to account, I mean, something on my mind is, I mean, we will often talk about case management and the idea of managing cases, and a case as a
Yes,
concept is a
that's another
very,
good one.
Yeah.
pretty loose, right? It's pretty, well, it's pretty
Yeah,
open as an idea of what a case is. And so in different contexts, it's going to really vary as to what's involved in a case, and even just practical stuff about how long one might run for and how many people are involved and is it a big deal or not,
And then you think of
and
a records
different.
person, and they'll say it's a transaction, and
Sure.
then all the troubles of the world.
yeah,
Meh. I think a case has to be more than one transaction. Anyway,
yeah.
uh, well, I mean, okay, it doesn't have to be, but would normally be. The other thing that was on my mind when you were first just bringing this concept to the table, Judy, was just sort of about how we in the land of records, in particular, just obsessing over retention and disposition and stuff,
Mm,
hang value on an activity rather than any of the other
yes,
things, any of the other entities related to that activity, at least in writing. So, so we might say that, well, I mean, like complaints management might be an example. And that sort of, there's just a sort of underlying assumption that the activity of dealing with complaint will always be of equal value, regardless of what the complaint relates to. Whereas it should be pretty trivial to step back and imagine a scenario where a complaint is absolutely much more serious, and therefore the information
yeah.
has higher value than some
And
other kind of a complaint. And
if you
it's not
put
about the activity. It's not. In both cases, you could argue that the activity being carried out by that organisation is the same, but it's because of the topic or because of the subject or because however you want to frame it. There is another thing
yeah,
in there. There is another set of concepts that, when related to the activity, the combo tells you something different about the value of the information. And I think I think
yeah,
the idea that you would try and describe an organization only through what it does, in kind of almost verbs only kind of a way, just seems really limited. Basically, it's like, sure, it could be really helpful in some ways, but it's like, why limit yourself to that?
and it's that's really well put about the verbs, thinking in terms of verbs only. And I mean, you also need to think about the verbs because there will be information about the verbs as well. So if we think about what did you say? Complaints management, you said. Now, if you put complaint in the middle, as it were, of your model, that's really helpful because you're actually focusing on the complaint and what it's about and what things it might be connected to. And managing that complaint will just be one little connector.
Mm.
The important thing is the complaint. which to me is
Right.
the most important in this respect, the most important thing to think about, not managing the complaint, because that's just a verb connected with it. It's the complaint itself that is the key thing that we have the information about. So we need to model around that. That's why we're talking about this. But then one shouldn't forget that managing the complaint is a bubble over here, if I can put it like that. And we will also have information about managing the complaint. This is how we manage a complaint. Here is our policy for managing complaints. So managing the complaint is an important concept, but the key concept is the complaint itself. Do you see what I mean? Does
It's
that make
actually
Yeah,
sense?
totally.
it's
It's just a
tailing right
different
into.
way of thinking about it. And it seems
Mm.
crucial to me.
But I mean, it's really interesting to me at the moment too, because it's tailing into some ways of thinking about, because I am starting to have to deal with structured data, business applications, data warehouses more and more and more and more often. And, I'm running into that very traditional view and one that I hold in lots of situations myself, that everything that's recorded is a record. And, starting to think about what the important points in that in the life of that thing are, and how much of what we're doing is just about an internal process of managing something, because it's which essentially makes it a form of ephemera. It's kind of tracking data. So in 99.9% of times, it's not going to be important. There are going to be definable points in the life where that thing becomes important. And it's the difference between, you look at CRM systems and, they have concepts in them like leads and conversations and tasks and those sorts of things. And it's like, well, I mean, is it important that, so-and-so said hello to someone else on, the 27th of January, 2019? I mean, that's probably not important. It's probably not important that, if somebody was tracking the value of something based on how they thought about it in that CRM system, that the value went up and down 40 times. But at the point at which they actually wrote a contract and said, this is how much it's worth, and this is the contract we're entering into, well, I mean, that's important. And how to think about those sorts of things in a really risk-based way. And it really does come back to those things, because you come back to contracts and, what is a contract? Well, I mean, it's a relationship between our organization and, somebody outside the organization. And you start to model those things to figure out what's important. It's actually just helped me join together a whole bunch of other concepts that I've been really grappling with recently. So bravo. And verbs only. Ha! Drop the mic. But I mean, really thinking about functional classification and some of the conversations we've had about that, like,
Yeah.
it struck me. It's a verbs only management system. And I mean, it tells you what's important to the organization. It's the doing of the legislative thing that they're supposed to do. I mean, try finding, okay, we've got this transaction and someone knows that we've done this transaction with this same person 10 times. Well, find those 10 times in the record system. You won't. Because we don't care about that detail, but we know where the transaction is.
In terms of like thinking about appraisal and thinking about how retention disposal schedules or whatever they're called in your jurisdiction, dear listener, thinking about those things, like they do fold the nouns in, and they do break from the pure concepts of functional stuff. It's just whether or not people point it out. So a really classic example in New Zealand is what are you supposed to do with HR records? And GDA 6 describes, this is what you do with HR records. But unless the people that those records are about are at this different subset, being basically the exec. And you can totally imagine that as a standard thing. And then there's this other one that's kind of the flavour of, or if they turned out to basically be a celebrity or someone of national significance, then we'd also like them, please. Can you send those ones to the archive? And there's always a bit of a joke about that.
We're more civilised over the ditch. We have GA 38 for ministers and secretaries and those sorts of people.
Oh, there you go.
They have their own schedule. Are we more civilised?
Yeah, well, nice. Aren't they lucky? So, I mean, so my point is that distinction is solely on the subject, right? It's not.
Yeah.
It's still the management of your personnel, or employees. it's not a change in the activity, but we're attributing different value based on who it's about.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
so I think it is actually true that appraisal done well is not limited in this way, but it is worth calling that out, I think, because for some people you just want to, you know, stay where it's safe and hold tight on one particular way of framing information. Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the interesting things for me about, I don't know, I've mentioned this before, ISO 15489, the 2016 update, they introduced appraisal, which, I mean, it's kind of amazing that there was a records management, ISO standard that didn't have appraisal in it before that. But
Talk about appraising. Yeah.
I know, but they really, I mean, the definition of appraisal is much broader than, it's not your archival appraisal. It really is about understanding the activity and, business risks around it. And I mean, I think that's got to be central to what we do.
And to fold that back in, I mean, how can we appreciate risk if we're not looking more broadly at all the kinds of things in the domain of what our organization is doing, or who we're interacting with, or what authorities or powers or constraints or obligations, all those kinds of things that are not just what do we do.
All of the nouns and the verbs that happen to them.
That's right. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. We won't talk about gerunds because that starts to get a bit more complicated. Anyway.
Yeah. Sometime last century when I was studying linguistics, I remember a modern English lecturer just looking wistfully into the distance and saying, there's not really a difference between verbs and nouns. And, and us poor undergraduates going, what? He was just pointing out that it's all just models.
Yes. Yes.
So, Judy, if you were, I mean, this is totally putting you on the spot, but if you were going to encourage people out there to think about domain modeling as something to get started on,
Yeah.
what could someone do in their day job, do you reckon, to kind of
Oh.
just shift the needle a bit?
I think it's quite hard to answer, but yeah, to shift the needle a bit. I mean, the thing is, the organisation is only going to care about this when it's trying to positively do something to change findability or reporting or joined upness. Well, that's kind of findability, isn't it? So, I mean, just someone in an information team is probably not going to get any traction by starting to talk about domain models. They might find it very interesting to do. But as something on the way to, for example, beginning to put together a business glossary, that would be a very good idea. If you don't have one already, that could be a very good idea. And start to collect all the taxonomies or whatever they are in the organization, put them together, start to do some, as it's known, facet analysis to try and work out what the different entities are. That could be something that's of practical use to the organization. Well, it would be, I'm sure, if there's nothing already. So that people at least, and you imagine a new person comes into an organization, there's always this wealth of words that you just don't understand what people mean by them in the organization. And maybe the people who are there already mean different things, as we've said already. But, it's really good for people coming into the organization to understand words that everybody else knows already, but also to get everybody across the organization meaning the same thing. That would be a valuable thing to do for lots of reasons, and then start to use that to integrate that into system to support findability. If you can get the people working in systems development on side to help them, which, I mean, we did recently in a New Zealand government department. The developers were delighted we were doing that work because it's it's pre-work that they have to do before they do their data modeling, their physical models, but someone else is doing it for them and making sure it's consistent across the organization. So it's really worth talking to system developers if you can get a moment of their time to try and see how that could be improved as well. And of course, once you've started to build up the vocabulary or the list of entities and how we describe them, you can also use that in other ways, including auto-categorization, which I think is a topic we were going to cover in another podcast at some point.
We really should.
Yeah, I know you're keen, Karl.
No doubt.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm happy. I'm very happy to talk about that subject.
Yeah.
And I think my suggestion is go to the top bar in PowerPoint, look for the icons button, and start using them. Because one of the things there's a guy I'm working with at the moment, and he does these. He uses PowerPoint documents to just kind of get everybody on the same page about everything. But I mean, they're all just models. He doesn't. There's very little text on. There's very little text on his slides. They're pretty much just, drawings of the way things flow through other things, and it's all icons and arrows, and you start at one end with not much of an understanding about what you're talking about, and you get to the other end and everyone's thinking the same way. And it's
I've got to say, whenever I've done this domain modeling work, and I can't think of an organization where that hasn't been true, you build up your model and you show it. There's some quite nice tools for showing it now. And people go, do you know, I hadn't thought of it like that before. I hadn't seen those connections. I hadn't quite appreciated that we care about these things. It's always interesting for the organization themselves to look at what their world in a different way.
I mean, I think they're wonderful thinking tools.
Yes,
one of the things
absolutely.
It's sort of like writing. Writing is one of my favorite tools for understanding a topic. But the other one is it's some form of modeling. Whether it's so often, if I need to present something or think about something new, that's what I end up doing. I end up just cutting.
Me too. Always.
I've got modeling programs that I use, and they are just full of these. Just basically boxes with relationships between them. And it's just such a valuable exercise. I just find that conceptually I go from nowhere to somewhere very fast. I see the inconsistencies in the way I think about things really quickly. Everyone else sees it even more quickly than I do, but I'm a bit slow on the uptake.
You get to catch up with them.
yeah, that's it, exactly. And then they know I've caught up with them. That's which is a bit of a shame, really.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, plenty to think about there. So thanks very much, Judi, and obviously Karl as well.
Oh, no, all Judi, definitely.
All Judi, yeah, brilliant. And we will catch you all again for another exciting episode of the Information Revolution next time. Thank you. See ya.
See ya.